The horse knew before he did. Sheriff Dutton felt the mare's muscles tense beneath him as they crested the ridge overlooking the abandoned Clearwater station. Below, a figure hunched against the weathered boards. Too small, too fragile for this god-forsaken stretch of prairie. When she lifted her face, dirt-streaked and hollow-eyed, clutching something wrapped in torn calico, his hand instinctively moved to his badge. The law was clear about runaways. But when her lips formed those words, "Please, let me keep the baby," something inside his chest cracked like drought-hardened earth meeting rain. The wind carried her voice across the empty space between them, fragile as spider silk, yet heavy enough to stop a man's heart. Sheriff Dutton had heard every kind of plea in his 23 years, wearing the star, desperate lies, bargained truths, the hollow promises of the guilty. But this whisper, barely audible above the prairie grass rustling like old bones, cut through his professional armor with surgical precision. The girl couldn't be more than 20, her dark hair matted against her skull, her dress torn at the shoulder where someone's rough hands had grabbed too hard. She pressed the bundle closer to her chest, and he caught the flash of tiny fingers, pink as dawn light. His horse shifted beneath him, ears pricked forward, with an animal's instinct for human suffering. Dutton had learned to trust the mare's judgment more than his own. She'd led him to 3 missing children and 2 murderers in the past year alone. Now she stood perfectly still, as if understanding that sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile moment held them all suspended between duty and mercy. The girl's eyes never left his face, searching for something he wasn't sure he possessed anymore. Hope, maybe, or just the absence of cruelty. The abandoned mail station squatted behind her like a broken promise, its roof sagging under years of neglect and the weight of too many disappointed travelers. Dutton remembered when it bustled with activity, stagecoaches thundering through twice weekly, passengers stretching their legs while horses were changed, the station master's wife serving coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Now only ghosts remained, and this slip of a girl who'd somehow found her way to the loneliest spot in 3 counties. The irony wasn't lost on him that she'd chosen a place where messages once connected distant hearts to make her desperate stand. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice rougher than intended. The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. He could see her flinch at the formality, the way it created distance when what she needed was understanding. But protocol demanded certain words, certain procedures, and Sheriff Dutton had built his reputation on following the law to the letter, even when the letter cut like a blade, even when it meant separating mothers from children, because some judge in a distant courthouse had decided what constituted proper care. The baby stirred in her arms, a soft mewling sound that seemed to echo across the vast emptiness surrounding them. Dutton watched the girl's face transform as she looked down, her features softening with a love so pure it made his chest ache. He'd seen that expression before, on his own wife's face, in those brief months before fever took both her and their unborn child. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and he had to grip the saddle horn to steady himself. Some wounds never healed. They just learned to hide better. She looked up at him again, and this time he saw the steel beneath her desperation. This wasn't just a frightened girl running from consequences. This was a mother who would fight heaven and hell to protect what was hers. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying across the distance between them with surprising clarity. "But I'm not what they said I was. And this baby—" She paused, swallowing hard. "This baby deserves better than what they had planned." The words settled over them like dust after a storm, heavy with implications that made Dutton's badge feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The mare took 3 steps forward, without any command from her rider, closing the distance between law and desperation with the kind of wisdom that comes from centuries of serving humans who rarely understood their own hearts. Dutton felt the decision being made beneath him, in the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth, in the way his horse's breathing had slowed to match the girl's ragged gasps. Animals knew things that men spent lifetimes trying to forget, that mercy was older than justice, that protection trumped protocol, that sometimes the right choice felt like falling off a cliff. The girl didn't move as they approached, but Dutton could see her muscles coiled like a spring, ready to run if his intentions proved hostile. She'd been running for a while, judging by the worn soles of her boots and the way her dress hung loose on her frame. Running from what, he could only guess, but the bruises on her wrists told part of the story, the kind of story that made good men do bad things and bad men sleep soundly at night. The kind of story that ended with young women clutching babies in abandoned places, whispering prayers to sheriffs who'd forgotten how to bend. "What's the child's name?" he asked, dismounting with deliberate slowness. The question surprised them both, him for asking it, her for the way it acknowledged the baby as more than evidence in whatever case had brought him here. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that would have been a luxury she couldn't afford until this moment. "Sarah," she whispered, and the name hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. "Sarah May. She's 3 weeks old today." The precision of the detail, the way she said it like a celebration despite their circumstances, told Dutton everything he needed to know about the kind of mother she was. His horse nickered softly, a sound that seemed to ease some of the tension from the girl's shoulders. Dutton had seen it before, the way animals could communicate comfort in ways that human words often failed to achieve. The mare had always been good with children, gentle as a lamb despite her size. Now she stretched her neck toward the bundle in the girl's arms, breathing softly, and for the first time since he'd crested the ridge, the girl smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of lips, but it transformed her face completely. "She likes horses," the girl said, adjusting the blanket so the baby could see the mare's dark eyes. "Back home, we had an old gelding named Thunder. Sarah would stop crying every time he whinnied." The past tense hung heavy in the air. Had, not have. Whatever home she spoke of was gone now. Another casualty in whatever war had driven her to this desolate place. Dutton found himself wondering about Thunder, about the life this girl had left behind, about the choices that had led to this moment of reckoning in the shadow of a forgotten mail station. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and Dutton made his choice. Not the one his badge demanded, not the one that would look good in his report, but the one his horse had been trying to tell him since they'd first laid eyes on this broken little family. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, offering it to the girl with hands that had arrested murderers and comforted widows, hands that knew the weight of both justice and mercy. "Drink," he said simply, and watched as she accepted the water like communion, like forgiveness, like the first step toward whatever came next in a world where sometimes the law had to lose for love to win. The abandoned mail station stood like a monument to forgotten promises, its weathered boards grey as old bones under the relentless sun. Sheriff Dutton had seen enough of these places to know their stories, dreams that had withered in the desert heat, hopes that had crumbled like the mortar between the stones. But today, this place felt different, charged with the electricity of a decision that would change everything. Mariah sat in the shade of the building's eastern wall, the baby nestled against her chest, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked almost peaceful. The water had brought color back to her cheeks, and the simple act of rest had smoothed some of the desperation from her features. He watched her from across the small clearing, his badge heavy against his chest like an accusation. The law was clear about runaways, about unmarried mothers, about children born outside the boundaries of respectability. There were procedures to follow, forms to fill out, institutions that would take the child and find Mariah a place where she could work off her shame in silence. It was the way things were done, the way they had always been done, and he had never questioned it before. But something about the way she held that baby, something about the fierce tenderness in her eyes, made all those procedures feel like violence dressed up in legal language. The horse stood patient in the heat, its dark coat gleaming with sweat, and Dutton found himself studying the animal as if it might hold answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. This was the same horse that had carried him through 20 years of law enforcement, through shootouts and manhunts, through the endless cycle of crime and punishment that defined his days. It had never failed him, never questioned his judgment, never made him doubt the righteousness of his cause. But now, as he looked at its steady brown eyes, he wondered if the horse understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that sometimes the most lawful thing a man could do was break the law. Mariah shifted slightly, adjusting the baby's position, and the movement caught his attention like a prayer. She was so young, barely more than a child herself, and yet there was something ancient in the way she protected her infant, something that reached back through generations of mothers who had fought against impossible odds to keep their children safe. He thought of his own mother, dead these 15 years, and how she had looked at him with that same fierce love when he was small and the world seemed too big and dangerous to navigate alone. The memory hit him like a physical blow, unexpected and sharp, and he had to look away from Mariah's face to keep his composure. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding, and Dutton realized that they had reached a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but everything that came after. He could mount his horse, take Mariah back to town, and let the machinery of justice grind forward as it always had. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice, the choice that would let him sleep at night knowing he had done his duty. Or he could choose something else entirely, something that would require him to redefine what duty meant, what justice looked like when it wore the face of a desperate young mother and her innocent child. The baby stirred in Mariah's arms, making a soft sound that was barely audible over the whisper of wind through the station's broken windows. And in that moment, Sheriff Dutton understood that some decisions were made not in the mind, but in the heart, and that the truest law was written not in books, but in the spaces between one human soul and another. Sheriff Dutton walked slowly toward Mariah, each step deliberate and measured, as if he were approaching an altar where he would either find salvation or damn himself forever. The dust rose in small clouds around his boots, and he could feel the weight of his gun at his hip, the badge on his chest, all the symbols of authority that had defined him for so long. But as he drew closer to the young woman and her child, those symbols felt less like armor and more like chains, binding him to a version of justice that suddenly seemed hollow and cruel. Mariah looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, only a weary acceptance of whatever fate he would deliver, and that resignation cut through him like a blade. "There's a town," he said quietly, settling down beside her in the shade, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. 3 days' ride north of here. Small place, quiet. They need a school teacher." He pulled off his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair, the gesture betraying a nervousness that 20 years of law enforcement had never quite managed to eliminate. "Woman there, Mrs. Henderson. Lost her husband last winter. She's been running the school alone, but she's getting on in years. Could use help." The words came slowly, carefully, as if he were building something fragile that might shatter if he spoke too quickly. Mariah stared at him, confusion replacing the resignation in her eyes, and he could see her trying to understand what he was offering, what it might mean for her and the baby. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the broken timbers of the station. "You're the law. You have to take me back." The baby stirred against her chest, and she instinctively tightened her hold, that protective gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "They'll come looking for me. They'll find us." "Not if you're dead," Dutton said simply, and the words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything he had ever believed about right and wrong. Not if Mariah died out here in the desert, and someone else Someone with a different name made it to that town up north. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with coins that represented months of careful saving. "This should be enough to get you started. Mrs. Henderson won't ask too many questions if you can teach the children to read and write." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the soft breathing of the baby in Mariah's arms. She looked at the money, then at his face, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke, some trap that would spring shut the moment she allowed herself to hope. But what she saw in his eyes was something she had never expected to find in a lawman. Compassion that ran deeper than duty, mercy that transcended the letter of the law. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of disappointment and betrayal. Dutton was quiet for a long moment, watching the way the light played across the baby's face, thinking of all the children he had seen over the years who had been failed by the very system he had sworn to uphold. "Because sometimes," he said finally, "the law gets it wrong. And sometimes a man has to choose between being a good sheriff and being a good human being." He stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long ride, and walked to his horse. From the saddlebag, he pulled out a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked with age and use. "This was my mother's," he said, pressing it into Mariah's free hand. "Inside the front cover, there's a letter of introduction. Says you're my cousin's daughter, come west after a fever took your family back east." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sheriff Dutton helped Mariah to her feet and watched as she gathered her few possessions with hands that shook not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of unexpected grace. He had made his choice, and there would be consequences. Questions from his superiors, sleepless nights wondering if he had done the right thing, the constant fear that his deception would be discovered. But as he looked at the young mother and her child, as he saw hope kindle in her eyes like a flame that had been nearly extinguished, he knew that some choices were worth whatever price they demanded, and that the truest justice was sometimes found not in following the law, but in following the heart. 3 years had passed since that dusty afternoon at the mail station, and the town of Cedar Ridge had grown accustomed to the sight of Mariah walking down Main Street, with little Samuel's hand clasped firmly in hers. The boy had her eyes but a steadier gait, his laughter ringing through the general store where she worked, sorting mail and mending what could be mended. Sheriff Dutton watched them sometimes from his office window, noting how the child's presence had softened the hard edges of a town that had forgotten how to hope. The wanted posters had long since yellowed and been replaced by notices of church socials and cattle auctions, as if the past had finally agreed to stay buried where it belonged. Mariah had taken the name Morrison, claiming to be a widow from back east, and the townspeople had accepted the story with the kind of willful blindness that small communities practice when they choose mercy over truth. She rented a small room above the bakery, and on Sundays she sat in the back pew of the church, Samuel fidgeting beside her as Reverend Hayes spoke of redemption and second chances. Her hands had grown steady from honest work, her voice had found its strength again, and though she still startled at sudden noises, the haunted look had faded from her eyes like morning mist burning off the prairie. Sheriff Dutton had never married, but he found himself stopping by the general store more often than necessary, bringing Samuel peppermint sticks and teaching him to whittle small horses from scraps of wood. The boy called him Uncle Dutch, and something in the sheriff's chest loosened every time he heard it, as if a knot he'd carried for years was finally coming undone. On quiet evenings, when the town settled into its familiar rhythms, Dutton would sit on his porch and remember that moment by the water trough when he'd chosen love over law and found that the choice had remade him entirely. The horse that had carried them to safety had been sold to a rancher north of town, but sometimes Mariah would see a similar bay mare in the distance and feel a flutter of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She had written letters to her sister back in Missouri, careful letters that spoke of new beginnings and God's grace, never mentioning the darkness she'd fled or the man whose name she'd buried along with her old life. Samuel would never know his father, and Mariah had made peace with that truth, understanding that some silences were gifts rather than burdens. The townspeople had their suspicions, of course, whispered conversations that died when Mariah entered a room. But Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where a person's present mattered more than their past. Mrs. Henderson at the bakery had taken Mariah under her wing, teaching her to braid bread and measure flour with the precision of prayer. And Dr. Caldwell had delivered Samuel through a bout of fever without asking questions about birth certificates or family histories. The community had wrapped around them like a quilt, imperfect but warm, holding them steady against whatever storms might come. Sheriff Dutton kept the truth locked in his heart like a sacred trust, never speaking of that day even to himself. But sometimes he would touch the badge on his chest and remember the weight of choosing between duty and compassion. He had expected consequences, investigations, questions that would unravel everything, but the silence had held, as if the prairie itself had conspired to protect what needed protecting. His deputy, young Tom Bradley, had learned to read his moods and never pressed when the sheriff grew quiet during certain conversations about missing persons or outstanding warrants. On Samuel's 3rd birthday, Mariah baked a small cake with Mrs. Henderson's help, and half the town showed up to celebrate, bringing gifts whittled from wood and sewn from scraps, offerings of belonging that meant more than gold. Sheriff Dutton arrived with a wooden rocking horse he'd carved himself, its mane flowing like captured wind, and when Samuel climbed onto its back with pure joy, Mariah felt something break open in her chest, not the familiar ache of loss, but the unfamiliar sweetness of hope taking root. The seasons turned as they always had, but now they carried different meanings. Spring brought the promise of Samuel's laughter echoing through the streets. Summer meant picnics by the creek where he learned to skip stones. Autumn painted the world in colors that matched his wonder, and winter wrapped them all in the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Mariah had stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped flinching at shadows, stopped believing that happiness was something that happened to other people in other places. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of prairie nights, Sheriff Dutton would step outside and look up at the stars, thinking about the choices that define a life and the moments when the heart overrules the head. He had broken the law that day by the water trough, but he had kept faith with something larger than law, the belief that mercy was not weakness, but the highest form of strength, and that sometimes the most important thing a man could do was simply look the other way and let love find its own path home. The wanted posters had faded and been forgotten. The past had settled into silence, and Cedar Ridge had gained a family it never knew it needed. A young mother whose courage had been tested and proven true. A child whose laughter reminded them all why they fought so hard to build something good in a harsh world. And a sheriff who had learned that the badge on his chest was not just a symbol of law, but a reminder that justice without compassion was just another form of cruelty, and that the truest service he could offer was not to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of what the law was meant to protect.